every time I picked the burger onto my face and they would say, Katie, tell us about the world building or something, and I'd be dripping meat juice down my wrist.
We're really looking forward to having a panel with you today on writing and resilience, navigating confidence and mindset challenges of being a writer. I'm Nicola Solomon, I'm the Chief Executive of the Society of Authors. Full disclosure, I'm not a writer, although I once wrote a book on personal injury law. With the Society of Authors being UK's biggest trade union for writers, I've got about 12,500 writer members who we give advice to, who give training and so on. And I see a lot of writers and their challenges, as you can imagine. But I've got a great panel of experts with real lived experience. And in order, next to me, Katie Khan, who's an author published by Penguin Random House, a writer from London whose first novel, Hold Back the Stars, was translated to more than 20 languages and is being adapted for film. That's another great experience. And was a finalist for the Romantic Novel Awards and shortlisted for Brave New Worlds, which celebrates originality in genre writing. And your second novel, always good to go on to second novel, as we also talk about, The Light Between Us, was published by Transworld, and it celebrates female friendship and time travel. And Kate is also the creative director of the Novelry, which is an online writing school. And she lives in London with her fluffy white blonde little Kelly Weeks, and mindset and confidence, and a marketing mentor for authors. She cares deeply, and she really does, about equipping authors with mindset and practical tools to help support them through journeys of becoming and thriving. She's got extensive industry experience and insight. She's worked in marketing at two of the UK's biggest publishers. I see you're very good, you don't tell everyone. And so she really does understand the particular challenges of this industry, but she also understands what it's like to work largely alone, having done that for 6 years. She's an accredited coach with the Institute of Leadership and Management, and she helps the authors navigate mindset and confidence challenges. And she also uses marketing expertise to help authors build their confidence in marketing ethic, particular focus on social media and marketing content. And last in order, but particularly not least, is Luan, a novice to the fair, interested in finding her way here. She's a Glasgow-born novelist and short story writer from East London. Her debut, Nightingale Point, was longlisted for the Women Moss Speaking over there and the R. Darchi Prize. And she's also the author of Homecoming, which featured on BBC Women's Hour, and These Streets, a family drama set in Stratford. And in 2018, she won the Costa Short Story Award, and her short stories appeared in Stylist, Hello Magazine, and the Sunday Express. Teacher, and she has over a decade's worth of experience teaching in the Capital School, not acquired and living on your own for 6 years, and also taught as a first story writer in residence, working with young people in town. So we're going to talk for a bit, and hopefully have some time at the end for questions, but it is all very packed on time. And what I wanted to start with is, we all know how hard it is to be a writer, working alone, creating things out of your head, seeing others being published or their books sell, negotiating with large publishers, facing rejection, and we're here to try and give some help, and also to remind you, actually, as James Spackman said at the talk we were at yesterday, just remember that the publishing industry, none of this here can exist without you and without your stories. But starting with Luan and Katie, biggest fear you faced when you started out writing and took that leap, and how did you overcome it? And Luan, I'm going to start with you.
Well, when I think about when I first started writing, there was no fear at all, because it was just, well, I'm just going to write. It was so natural and normal for me to just write all the time ever since I was a kid. Writing. I just didn't connect it that I could be a professional writer, that anyone else would read my writing. Sometimes my friends would read my writing. And probably what would be called fan fiction now is the kind of stuff I used to write when I was like too young to write that sort of stuff, like 13, 14, 15. And then when I started thinking, oh, I could actually be a writer, like I could put this out into the world and other people could read it, I still didn't have the fear. It was only when my first book was published, the idea that my mum and my aunties, and there are lots of aunties, that they would read, that's the only fear I've ever had. I've never had that fear about strangers reading my work or it really going out into the world. It's like people close to you reading your work. and looking for themselves in it. That has been I didn't have any fear about the publishing process or anything like that, because I didn't understand it. I didn't know about all this stuff we have to think about now, marketing, is my book going to be a success and can I make a career out of this? I wasn't scared about that because I didn't know anything about it. It was purely just, is my mum going to read this?
My experience was quite similar to Luan in that when I started writing, I didn't know that much about publishing, so I just focused on the story that I wanted to write. But I do remember becoming very overwhelmed when I structured the novel, that I knew it was quite an ambitious dual timeline and it was the first novel that I'd written, and I'd started a writing course a few months in, and they said, oh, you're writing this dual timeline novel about two people falling in space, and I said, oh no, I've had to put that away, it's far too scary, I don't think I can structure it. So at that time, all of my considerations and my fear were about, am I capable of doing this? Can I write this whole story? Can I do it justice? Do I know how to balance two timelines within a novel and bring them together so that they're both equally interesting? I think when you're reading a dual timeline novel, there's nothing worse than when one timeline is much more interesting than the other, and every time it cuts, you think, oh no, I was really enjoying that other story and I want to go back to it. And so that was my main consideration. I was working in the film industry, which I think makes people presume that I would understand how publishing works. And I knew I had to get an agent, and I knew that it would go out to publishers if it was good enough and ready. But I just had this belief that if I carried on going and I got over that block of how do I actually write this story, that I would get there. So fear-wise, I was quite fearless, I would say. And it's interesting how it's changed. Now I'm writing my third novel, and I feel like you become more aware of every possible decision that you can make and how to stay published and all of that kind of thing. But in the beginning, it was purely me and the story, me and the manuscript. How do I tell this story well enough to give it that alchemy where it becomes a novel rather than a manuscript or a Word document? So it was just about the confidence of keeping going and going back to it even when I told myself that maybe I wasn't up to the task yet.
You find is that people start off very brave.
Yes, absolutely. That's really common. Both of your stories, I hear a lot. It's the starting is quite easy because it's very personal. It's just you and your writing. You're in a safe environment. You're just on your own. And it's when things start to become real that your mind starts playing with you. So it's the prospect, and different people, it's really interesting to hear your kind of different fears because everyone is different. So how you react is going to be really personal to you. But often we've got like these underlying fears or limiting beliefs that sort of come into play. So when you start thinking about, this is actually a possibility now and I'm going to send it out into the world, if you deep down have got this worry that maybe people like you don't get published, or you're too young, or you're too old, or you're worried what your family is going to think, your brain almost starts to work against you because ultimately your brain is there to keep you safe. And because you have this fear, your brain is desperately trying to protect you. So if you're scared about your book being visible and what might happen, what's the best way of protecting you? Stopping you writing the book. So it's really interesting, that kind of mindset trick, but it is very common, so it's to have that kind of moment. This is real and I've got to push through it, so it's just looking at how you can move through that overwhelm and block.
And Katie, you said you did stop at some point, so how did you get through it? What were there things that helped?
So I was lucky in that I had somebody who said, no, we thought that was an idea which had a lot of promise, you have to write it. And that was because I'd signed up to a writing course. And so having that external impetus of someone saying, no, it's a good idea, yes, it's going to be a little bit difficult to write, but you should absolutely do it, was invaluable to me. And in the job that I do at the Novelry, where I'm creative director and I mentor writers writing speculative and science fiction, quite often I think that early vote of confidence in your idea, not necessarily in your writing, I think that you should keep that quite private in first draft and keep that just for you, but talking through your idea for a story with someone who knows what a good story is, I think can be really invaluable and give you that vote of confidence. Like for me, it came externally at that stage, and now I'm trying to learn to internalize it and judge myself whether it's a good idea and something that's worth writing and spending a year or two of my life on. So that's the journey that I...
And did fear of your families?
I was too long gone in that process of that book and that story and just believing in it. So.
And I'm going to ask you all a bit, and put both questions in. Writing routines, did that help? And are there times when you need to get away from it, or are you the sort of people who sit there and work 23 hours a day, or do you need other things outside there to keep you going?
Yeah, I've always had a day job around being an author, and particularly when I was writing my first draft, I was working at a film studio where I was doing 60-hour weeks on average. And so for me, I wrote my first novel at midnight. I would always write between 10 and 12 at night, 11 or 1 a.m. And I found that there are no shortcuts with that. Like, you have to sit down and visit the world of your story as regularly as possible. And what I did find is that when I would put the novel down for a couple of months, perhaps at a time, that when I would go back to the novel, I would end up reading back through what I'd already written to remind myself of where I got to, and then I would get really depressed because it wasn't as good as I remembered. Of course not, because it was at first draft, but also I would lose 3 hours cleaning up the prose, moving around commas, rather than creating new material. So for me, a writing routine, even if it's not, 6 a.m. every day, I still actually write late at night at the moment. I still haven't been able to break that habit, but for me, it's about visiting the world of my story as often as I can, and I sit down knowing, today I need to write the scene where the two characters meet for the first time, and it means I can make forward progress on the novel rather than having to go back over what I've already written. So for me, it's valuable, but I haven't yet managed to do, the golden hour method of 6 in the morning every single day. Not yet, but I live in hope. What about you, Luan?
Yeah, just what you're saying about you have to kind of be in that world, because I do that, especially in the past when I've been working alongside writing. You have a gap away from your story, and you do lose time when you come back to it. You've got to get familiar with everything again, and you just don't have that kind of time. So I was teaching at primary schools when I wrote my first, second and third. Yeah, oh my gosh. And also my first book is when I just had a baby, so that was like a bad idea. I don't know why I was trying to juggle all those things at the same time. So just squeezing in writing whenever I could. And then now writing my fourth book, I'm a full-time writer. So now it's very, very different. I've got to show up. It's my job. I've got to be there. And it's okay, I don't really procrastinate. I do use an internet blocker. I don't really leave the house during office hours. I am just there writing, so I'm quite disciplined with it. But it is very different to when you're working a job and squeezing in writing around it. You just got to be disciplined. You've got to want to do it, right? Or you're not going to get it finished.
Yeah, I mean, Kelly, I'm sure you've got some really good tips to add to this as well. One of the ones that I would say, though, that we always say at the Society of Authors, we usually in the summer have a summer challenge, and once it was the SOA does yoga, but it was mostly because we found that for writers the problem wasn't getting them sitting at their desks, it was getting them away from their desks, and we wanted them at least for 1 hour a day to get out and get some fresh air.
It's really interesting, and I think a big thing is about thinking about discipline rather than motivation. We often wait till we feel ready to do something or motivated to do it, and actually that feeling rarely comes. So it's what you can do to make yourself disciplined. And again, I would say everyone is very different. So spend some time thinking what's worked for you in the past. I mean, this might be the first time you're writing a book, but what's worked for you in the past in your day job or in another area of your life? How can you recreate? So if you're someone where getting up in the morning and doing morning routine works, do that, that's great. The fact that Katie works in the evening, that's what works for her. So I wouldn't try to follow too many rules. I'd really lean into what works for you. But certainly the regularly showing up, so you're creating that habit, I think is really important. And on time, I meet a lot of people who are waiting to have a whole day to sit down and write, or waiting to the weekend when they've got a bit more focus. You can write in really short bursts of time. It's much better to sit down for a quarter of an hour and do something, if you can do that every day, than wait until you have that magical free day, which frankly doesn't come. If you can work on putting in even a really short period each day, once you've got that as a habit, it's a lot easier to extend that time and build up from that than waiting for kind of big chunks of time.
I remember once asking about how to become a successful writer, and he said it takes talent, it takes luck, but it takes a lot of hard work. And he said quite particularly, you have to go to your desk, because your muse might visit your desk, but if your muse visits to your desk and you're not there. You don't have to be inspired first. You know, your muse doesn't necessarily come to you when you're walking the street. The muse comes to your desk when you're doing that writing. Some very good, some very good. But as you say, I think it's really different for different people. So now you wrote your first book review, but how did you know it was finished, and how did you then start thinking about the publishing process, start thinking about this as something of not being for me, but I want to take elsewhere? What was the moment when this is finished and I'm going to offer it to somebody else?
Because the first thing I wrote, which I thought was my finished book, apparently it wasn't, and it's still not. I kind of sent that out like, this is great, and everyone was like, no. And then I wrote the second thing, and then still in my head I was like, okay, this is a book, this is ready to go. I've spent like 8 years on it, it's ready to go. And then you get your editor, and your editor's like, no, this is what you're gonna do. And having to rewrite that whole thing so many times, so I didn't know. And even now, book 4, I don't know.
And
It
I
might be
guess
finished.
that ties in with what you said, Katie, about the moment you decide to show it to somebody else. Tell us a bit about what your experience with the finished work.
So when I finished my first novel, it had taken me a couple of years, writing at midnight, and I first showed it to a couple of friends. So someone I met on a writing course, and a friend of mine who read sort of every big book. You know, she was the first person to say, have you read this book called Gone Girl? So I thought, oh, you'll have an interesting take as a reader, and then my writer friend will have an interesting take as a fellow writer. And I just asked them to flag up, you know, the moments where perhaps they lost interest or it was unclear, you know, very much where their interest waned. And when they came back to me, actually their comments were quite specifically small. The novel was set in the near future, and they said, oh, everybody's drinking flat whites and it feels a bit contemporary. And I thought, do you know what, if that's your biggest problem with it, when I've really been wrangling with those dual timelines, I think I'm just going to send it to agents. So I sent it out, and a bit like you, Luan, I haven't necessarily had that extreme confidence that I had with that book, where I was like, I think it's ready, I'll send it out again. Because with that book I was really lucky. I sent it to agents and I actually had an offer within 6 hours, which I think is fairly unheard of in that way. And so it all moved very quickly from that point. But with my second and third book that I'm currently writing, when is it finished, when is it ready, the goalposts always shift. And as Luan says, you know, I did a lot of edits with, I did 2 drafts with my agent, Juliet Mushins. Then you do about 4 structural drafts with your publisher, through, you know, a structural draft, line edits, copy edits. So the book isn't finished when you think it is, but is it acceptable to send out for other people to read it, and will it hold their interest? I think those are very different things.
And Kelly, would you like to add anything to that?
I think it's just really interesting to think that we are often so focused on one point, whether that's getting the book out to an agent or getting the deal, but what's coming through from these 2 stories is there are moments throughout the career. So building your resilience all the way through it, there's always going to be challenges. So actually, if you can equip yourself to be able to deal with challenges, it's a challenging industry, you're going to need to do that. So there's a guy in America called Brendan Bouchard, and he talks about planning for things to go wrong. So it's not assuming that they will go wrong, but just having your mind that things are going to be challenging, so you don't go into everything thinking it's going to be really plain sailing, so that you can handle those moments if something takes a bit longer or you get a bit of negative feedback when they come up.
And I think it's worth remembering that this is, between industries, this is basically the only industry where when someone turns you down, it's literally called a rejection slip, and you are facing rejection again and again, and it's very difficult. I know particularly like short stories and competitions. How did you deal with rejection of your work and continue? Because the other thing is, exactly as you say, one gets rejection throughout one's career. How do you manage that? You don't get sucked into the silliness and don't come for all 3 days at the fair, I know.
I don't know, it's difficult. I mean, my first book, the one which went on to be published and became Nightingale Point, I mean, that was outright rejected by, felt like the world, nobody wanted that book. And what was really hurtful about it is, they were like, we like your writing, we'll read what you write next, but we can't have this particular book, because there were lots of other reasons to do with the topic of the book. So that was really, really difficult, because it was kind of like, well, write another book and come back. But okay, I don't have another 8 years to write another book, but obviously I did. So I was like, I really, really want to be published now. But yeah, it's difficult. I still don't really know how to deal with rejection. I don't know if I'm going about it the right way. I throw a bit of a straw. I don't know what you're meant to do. You just you just got to get through it, haven't you, and then get back to your desk.
What about you, Katie? Do you first or?
I definitely take rejection quite personally, but I've had to make peace with the fact that I don't like the word rejection, but it is part of the writing experience. And I was thinking as you were talking that I didn't experience what felt like that much rejection with my first novel. And yet there was an agent who rejected it it didn't match their list. And even books that end up selling at auction. So for example, my debut novel went out to 14 publishers and it ended up in an auction of 3 or 4 publishers. That means that there are still 10 rejections in there, and yet that's a buzzy book that gets sold at auction. You get, that lovely big write-up. Mine was at Frankfurt Book Fair, which was, a real experience. And yet there are 10 rejections in there. So I think making peace with the fact that every stage of the journey, every successful author has to deal with rejection, and it comes in lots of different forms. Yes, at the first point it might be querying agents. Yes, it might be going on submission to publishers. But even I showed a draft of my 3rd novel to my agent in January, and she had some quite bracing feedback on that. These are the things that we think you've done brilliantly. These are the things that are just not working. And I went and I lay down in bed and had a little cry for a day, and then I had to get back to work. And that's, I think, the only way that you can kind of bracingly handle feedback is, rejection is a form of feedback. And some of it can be dismissed out of hand, and some of it's extremely constructive. And you have to make peace with that if you want to be a published author, I think, and stay published.
And you're saying your book went out and you've won prizes. Have you ever faced imposter syndrome? Have you ever had that moment when you're like, I don't know why I'm the person sitting up on this stage here, and do you do it?
I think we should. Imposter syndrome. And it goes for me with working mum guilt.
Yeah.
I just don't do those things. I just hate the way they sound. I just don't do them. Like, I sat there and I wrote those books, and it took me a long time. And there were a lot of other really fun things I could have been doing, but I put in the work, do you know what I mean? So I'm just not doing the imposter syndrome thing.
Good for you. You?
Or I
Don't do it. Just say no.
I so wish I had your attitude to it. I'm afraid imposter syndrome regularly gets the better of me. I think the moment where I can remember feeling the most amount of imposter syndrome was when I went for a meeting in Los Angeles with film producers and directors about my book, and I was sitting there eating lunch with the producers of Stranger Things talking about my story, and that's when I just thought, oh, have I earned this? Like, do I belong? And the other thing that was funny about that moment was that we had gone for lunch and they let me order first, and I ordered a burger, and then they ordered kale salads. So every time I picked the burger up to my face, and they would say, Katie, tell us about the world building or something, and I'd be dripping meat juice down my wrist. Never order a burger in a professional meeting in Los Angeles. Everyone else will have salad. That's my best tip.
And Kelly, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think imposter syndrome, or that kind of doubt and nerves about yourself, is really common. I would suggest leaning into what you have achieved. We're so focused on where we're not rather than looking back at what we've done. So a lot of what I tell people to do, it's all about having a conversation in your head. Every time you have these thoughts, look for the evidence, look for the counter argument. When you're saying you're not good enough, look what you have achieved, what you did last week. You've written a whole book. I mean, there's lots of people who haven't written a whole book. Look for that evidence that actually you are going the right way and you've got all this brilliant stuff behind you, and use that to kind of power through those feelings when you're doubting yourself.
These are really good tips as well for working when you're negotiating with publishers and commissioners. But do any of you have any specific tips to negotiation? I'm going to keep it quite short now so we have plenty of time for questions. But obviously you've got agents, but you had to negotiate with your agents. So how do you feel that negotiating arguments with your editors and so on? Do you have the confidence for that?
Confident, but I'm aware that I can be quite fiery, and it's not helpful. So I'm kind of quiet for a bit, and I have an amazing agent, and I can phone her, and I have an amazing agent. I'm very, very lucky, so I haven't had to do that much negotiating with publishers.
I think for me, it's about remembering that it's a professional relationship, and that often with publishing, and as writers, we tend to always lead with it from the heart. But from the moment that you write a query letter to an agent, it's a business relationship, and you're presenting yourself professionally. I think for me, the place where there's the most interesting dynamic when working with publishers is in the editing process with editorial notes, because it is always a discussion. And what I've learned through that is that quite often when an editor tells you that something's not working in your novel, they're very often right. But sometimes when they suggest a very specific fix, they're not quite right. And as the writer, it's up to me to interpret that, say, okay, this part of my novel's not working. How can I come up with a solution that addresses the note, makes the whole thing better, but is a solution that I'm comfortable with? So I feel like there's the most room there when working editorially, in a sort of negotiation on editorial. But for everything else, I often use my agent as my very much my professional wingman, and always try and remember that it's a business relationship, and it's so easy to be led by the heart, but often I have to speak with the very, very polite email.
And I think one of the really important things that you've both picked up is it is a professional relationship, and what you have to be professional. You have to behave like a professional. You can't see fit in front of you. You can't have your family as well. I'm going to go on just a bit to things about self-marketing, because even if you're not negotiating directly, these days people are expected to self-market, be on social media, whatever. How do you make that feel authentic and bigging yourself up and selling your books or whatever? Do you have a tip for that? I'll start with you.
I think Kelly has given me some really great advice on this, and I'm going to paraphrase you and then push it to you, because it reminded me of something, which is that as authors, sharing your book online can feel a lot like you're saying, me, like, look at me, here's my book, buy my book, and it can feel very one note, and we have a tendency to do that once and then run away and hide. And be a bit embarrassed that we've asked people to buy a product. And Kelly has reminded me that actually talking about your novel, people need to see it quite a few times to actually remember. And I had an interesting experience where I made a very silly reel on Instagram last year, maybe, or January of this year, and lots of people were like, thought it was new news. Whereas for me, it's something I feel like I've talked about loads, but I got loads of congratulations messages, like it was a new thing. And I just thought, wow, I didn't talk about this enough for it to register with anyone who follows me. So that's probably my best advice. And Kelly, I definitely feel like marketing is your expertise here.
Yeah, we're dying to hear from you, Kelly.
Yeah, it's a bit hard. It's a bit hard to condense it in a couple of seconds, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, I always say to people, you've written a book to entertain someone or to help someone, or with a purpose.
No such thing as a perfect first draft. So give yourself the freedom to explore and experiment on the page, knowing that it might not stay, but you might find the absolute way into telling the story and make peace with it. But it's okay to go a little bit slow and steady, but it might have to be cut, because that's part of the journey. I think it's a really different experience writing a second novel to contract, having had all the time in the world to get your first book ready. But publishers know that, and they don't expect it to be at the same level that your first book was when they saw it, honestly. I did get stage fright. I sold the idea to my publisher along with the first book, and so for me, I actually joined the novelry to write the book and have that little bit of extra support and a bit of structure and deadline. And so what I did really quickly, I was working on a film set at the time, and I had to carve out a lunch break for that. That was the only time where people weren't going to pester me, because they were all eating lunch on set, and so I worked out that I had 40 minutes a day to do it. And actually being that disciplined, which I hadn't been on my first novel, would help me write it. But my goodness, it's such a different thing writing with the door open, and especially when you start to see things appear on Goodreads and reviews of your first book as you're writing your second, it's really tough.
Can we do one final question? So Kelly, do you want to start with people who love the rewrite more than the write?
I think that's really interesting. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. It's lean into to what you enjoy, and if that's what you enjoy, then maybe your process is get first draft done fast, because actually your zone of genius is the rewrite. There are other people who struggle with the rewrite but love the first draft. So I think the whole point of this conversation is there's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's about working out what's going to work for you, and if what works for you is the rewrites, that's brilliant.
Unfortunately, I think that's all we've got time for. I think it's been fascinating, and I'm sure that thank you so much, Katie and Kelly and Luan.